Adolf Hitler's declaration of war on the United States on December 11, 1941, stands as one of the most baffling and consequential decisions of the Second World War, a turning point where ideology overwhelmed strategy and sealed the fate of the Third Reich. To understand the magnitude of this moment, one must first appreciate the broader geopolitical landscape into which Hitler stepped when he addressed the Reichstag 4 days after Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor. For 2 years, Europe had been engulfed in flames as Germany's blitzkrieg tactics tore through Poland, France, the Low Countries, and the Balkans. Britain, though bloodied, had refused to yield, and the newly initiated war in the Soviet Union demanded more troops and resources than any campaign Hitler had ever envisioned. In the midst of this monumental struggle, the United States had remained officially neutral, but neutrality did not mean indifference. President Franklin D. Roosevelt's administration walked a delicate line between avoiding direct military confrontation and providing decisive support to the Allies. Through programs like Lend-Lease, the U.S. shipped tanks, aircraft, ammunition, food, and critical supplies to Britain and later the Soviet Union, ensuring that Hitler's enemies could continue resisting. American destroyers escorted convoys across the Atlantic, clashing with German U-boats in a series of undeclared naval skirmishes that foreshadowed a wider conflict. Roosevelt, deeply opposed to fascism, believed that the survival of democracy depended on the defeat of Nazi Germany. Yet he remained constrained by powerful isolationist movements and domestic political tensions. It was Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor that shattered this uneasy balance, transforming the American public almost overnight from cautious observers to determined participants in a global struggle. What Hitler did next, declaring war on the United States before Washington had even declared war on Germany, was not a response to treaty obligations or strategic necessity, but a decision born from hubris, miscalculation, and ideological delusion. He saw in America a country weakened by racial diversity, distracted by capitalism, and manipulated, in his view, by what he called Jewish influence. He believed its military strength was superficial, its people unwilling to fight, its industries incapable of matching Germany's wartime efficiency. These assumptions were disastrously wrong. The moment Hitler announced war, he transformed the conflict into a true world war, uniting the 3 greatest industrial powers of the era, the United States, Britain, and the Soviet Union, into a single coordinated alliance against the Axis. The consequences were immediate and far-reaching. The full weight of American industry mobilized with astonishing speed. German supply lines and resource capacities were overwhelmed. The Atlantic became an increasingly hostile arena for U-boats as American shipyards poured out destroyers, carriers, and merchant vessels in record numbers. And strategic bombing campaigns intensified as American air power joined Britain in the destruction of Germany's industrial heart. Hitler had believed that Japan's entry into the war would relieve pressure on Germany by forcing the United States to fight in the Pacific, but instead he found himself facing an enemy with immense production capacity and unified political will. The declaration of war also revealed deep structural flaws within the Nazi system: the absence of dissent or critical debate, the subordination of military reality to ideological fantasy, and Hitler's absolute authority, which allowed one man's misjudgment to dictate the fate of an entire nation. In the years that followed, American troops would land in North Africa, Italy, France, and Germany itself, making the United States central to every major Allied operation that dismantled Hitler's empire. Without Hitler's declaration, the timeline of American involvement in Europe might have been different, slower, more constrained, or politically contested, but his impulsive decision swept away all barriers, giving Roosevelt the legal and political mandate to wage full-scale war in both the Atlantic and Pacific. By declaring war, Hitler did not merely add another opponent, he added the opponent most capable of organizing a vast global coalition, supplying allies on 2 continents, and sustaining long campaigns across oceans and battlefields. The weight of American logistics, production, and manpower turned the tide in North Africa, strengthened Britain, revitalized the Soviet Union, and ultimately crushed Germany's capacity to resist. What Hitler intended as a defiant challenge became in effect the beginning of the end for the Third Reich. His declaration on December 11th stands as a stark reminder that wars are not won by bravado or ideological certainty, but by resources, alliances, strategy, and a sober understanding of one's enemies. In the years leading up to 1941, the relationship between Nazi Germany and the United States evolved from distant wariness into a tense and unmistakable trajectory toward confrontation. Although Washington initially adhered to a policy of neutrality, the growing aggression of Adolf Hitler's regime steadily eroded the illusion that distance alone could protect American interests. The United States watched uneasily as Germany dismantled the post-World War I order, defied the Treaty of Versailles, and launched a sweeping campaign of expansion across Europe. Each of these actions did more than reshape the geopolitical map. They raised fundamental questions about whether the democratic world could coexist with a totalitarian power openly committed to overturning it. American leaders understood that Germany's ambitions were not confined to the European continent. Its ideological message, military strategy, and economic aspirations projected global consequences that eventually threatened U.S. security directly. By the late 1930s, Franklin D. Roosevelt recognized that Hitler's ambitions were incompatible with American interests, even as isolationist sentiment restrained Washington from entering the conflict. Despite the neutrality laws that limited U.S. involvement, Roosevelt explored every political and diplomatic avenue to counter German influence without provoking open war. He tightened economic restrictions on the Reich, increased military spending at home, and sought ways to support nations resisting German domination, especially Britain. These measures were not merely symbolic gestures, but a calculated response to Hitler's expanding power. Berlin, however, interpreted these developments as evidence that the United States was already engaging in an undeclared conflict. To Hitler, Roosevelt's efforts represented a direct challenge to Germany's strategic goals and a signal that the United States might eventually intervene militarily. Germany's ideological hostility toward the United States further sharpened tensions between the two nations. Nazi propaganda portrayed American democracy as weak, corrupt, and fundamentally incompatible with the racial hierarchy at the core of Hitler's worldview. While Berlin publicly expressed hope for bilateral neutrality, internal communications revealed a deep contempt for American social and political structures. Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine worked tirelessly to depict the United States as a decadent society manipulated by Jews, plutocrats, and what the Nazis viewed as racially inferior groups. These portrayals were not simply rhetorical flourishes, they reflected a broader strategy to delegitimize the United States as a moral or political force capable of challenging Germany's rise. As ideological opposition deepened, diplomatic bridges that once facilitated dialogue began to erode. Economics played an equally significant role in the deteriorating relationship. Before the war, Germany and the United States were significant trading partners, but Hitler's policies aimed at autarky and territorial expansion reshaped the economic dynamic. The Reich increasingly sought to dominate European markets through conquest, undermining American economic influence in the region. Washington recognized that a German-controlled Europe could become an autarkic economic bloc, capable of cutting off U.S. access to vital markets and resources. Washington's administration feared the emergence of a world divided into hostile economic spheres, in which American trade would be severely restricted. This economic competition fueled strategic distrust and convinced many in Washington that a German victory in Europe would jeopardize America's long-term prosperity and security. Diplomatic relations, though never formally severed before 1941, became increasingly strained. German officials complained bitterly about American support for Britain, arguing that U.S. assistance violated neutrality and amounted to a hostile act. Roosevelt, for his part, viewed Germany's diplomatic protests as both hypocritical and strategically motivated. The Reich sought to intimidate the United States into withdrawing aid from Britain, while simultaneously preparing for expanded conflict in Europe and North Africa. American diplomats stationed in Berlin reported on the increasingly belligerent tone of Nazi leaders, who spoke openly about the inevitability of a global confrontation between fascism and democracy. These reports shaped Washington's evolving perception of Germany as a state whose ambitions could not be contained through negotiation alone. Hitler's decision to unleash unrestricted U-boat operations in the Atlantic further accelerated the deterioration of German-American relations. German submarines prowled the shipping lanes used by British and American vessels, threatening the maritime lifelines essential to the Allied war effort. While Hitler initially attempted to avoid direct clashes with the United States, his naval commanders pushed for a more aggressive posture, arguing that American deliveries to Britain were prolonging the war. As German submarines came increasingly close to American ships, the Atlantic became a pressure point that drew the two nations closer to conflict. Roosevelt responded by expanding naval patrols, authorizing the escort of supply convoys, and gradually increasing the role of the U.S. Navy in protecting Allied shipping. Several incidents at sea transformed German-American tensions into a series of dangerous confrontations. The sinking of the American destroyer USS Reuben James in October 1941, killing over 100 U.S. sailors, was a turning point. Although Germany insisted that the ship was escorting a British convoy and therefore a legitimate target, the attack outraged American public opinion and hardened Roosevelt's resolve. The United States had not yet formally entered the war, but the reality on the Atlantic suggested otherwise. German naval commanders believed they were undermining Britain's lifeline, while American leaders saw the attacks as further proof that Hitler sought dominance at any cost. These confrontations marked the collapse of even the pretense of neutrality and demonstrated how dangerously close the two nations had come to direct war. At the political level, Roosevelt's Lend-Lease program symbolized the decisive shift in American policy toward active but indirect involvement in the war against Germany. Announced in early 1941, Lend-Lease allowed the United States to supply arms, equipment, and food to Britain and other nations resisting Axis aggression. Hitler saw this policy as the clearest evidence yet that the United States had chosen sides. German intelligence reported that American factories were rapidly increasing production, fueling the British war effort and strengthening global resistance to fascism. The program's scope eventually expanded to include the Soviet Union after Germany's invasion in June 1941, further enraging Hitler. From the German perspective, the United States had effectively become the arsenal of democracy, intervening economically and strategically against the Reich without formally declaring war. Roosevelt's speeches during this period also intensified German-American tensions. His Four Freedoms Address articulated a moral vision directly opposed to Hitler's worldview, defending democracy, individual liberty, and international cooperation. Nazi leaders interpreted the speech as a declaration of ideological war. Similarly, Roosevelt's fireside chats warned Americans about the dangers posed by totalitarian aggression, implicitly identifying Nazi Germany as a threat that could not be ignored. These communications shaped public opinion in the United States, helping shift the nation away from isolationism and preparing Americans for the possibility of direct conflict. Behind the scenes, American intelligence agencies monitored Germany's growing espionage activities on U.S. soil. Although the Nazi spy network in America was far less effective than Berlin hoped, its existence fueled suspicion and sparked concerns about subversion. The FBI uncovered several German efforts to influence public opinion, sabotage critical infrastructure, and gather sensitive information. These revelations damaged trust between Washington and Berlin, reinforcing Roosevelt's belief that Germany did not respect American sovereignty. Hitler, meanwhile, believed that the United States was conducting its own intelligence operations against the Reich, deepening the sense of mutual hostility and mistrust. Even before Pearl Harbor, Hitler had begun to consider the possibility of a future clash with the United States. Although he publicly downplayed the likelihood of such a conflict, his private discussions reveal a leader increasingly convinced that America represented a long-term strategic rival. Hitler believed that the United States was driven by capitalist interests, manipulated by what he termed Jewish influence, and determined to undermine Germany's rise. These conspiratorial beliefs shaped his view of American policy, leading him to interpret nearly every U.S. action as evidence of hostility. By mid-1941, Hitler concluded that America's growing support for Britain and the Soviet Union made eventual conflict increasingly likely, even if the timing remained uncertain. The attack on Pearl Harbor on December 7, 1941, sent a seismic shock through the global strategic landscape, instantly transforming the geopolitical calculations of nations across the world, including Nazi Germany. Although the strike was carried out by Japan, its consequences rippled far beyond the Pacific. For the United States, the attack shattered any remaining illusions of neutrality and unified the nation behind the necessity of war. For Germany, it triggered a complex reassessment of the global balance of power, the nature of the conflict unfolding, and the potential opportunities and dangers that now lay ahead. Hitler had long anticipated a clash between Japan and the United States, but even he was surprised by the suddenness and scale of the strike. As news of the attack reached Berlin, German leaders celebrated the humiliation of a nation they perceived as decadent and unprepared. Yet beneath the jubilation lay uncertainty about what the new alignment of power would mean for the Reich. In the immediate aftermath of Pearl Harbor, Germany's diplomatic and military leadership scrambled to interpret Japan's intentions. Tokyo had informed Berlin of the worsening crisis with Washington, but had not disclosed the exact timing or nature of the attack. When the news broke, Hitler viewed it as a pivotal strategic development, a potential turning point that could reshape the global war in Germany's favor. He believed that Japan's entry into the conflict would force the United States to divert its resources and attention to the Pacific, thereby reducing the pressure on Britain and the Soviet Union. This assumption was deeply rooted in Hitler's tendency to underestimate American industrial capacity and overestimate Japan's ability to sustain a prolonged conflict. For Hitler, the attack on Pearl Harbor appeared to offer a moment of strategic opportunity at a time when the Eastern Front was beginning to place enormous strain on German forces. As Germany processed the implications of Pearl Harbor, its leadership considered how the new circumstances could be leveraged to reinforce the Axis alliance. The Tripartite Pact, signed in September 1940, had bound Germany, Italy, and Japan in a loose coalition aimed at deterring the United States from entering the war. The agreement stipulated that if any of the signatories were attacked by a nation not already involved in the conflict, the others would come to its aid. However, the pact did not require Germany to declare war if Japan initiated hostilities. In the days following the attack, German officials debated whether to activate the alliance fully or maintain a more cautious diplomatic stance. Some argued that Germany should take advantage of Japan's bold move to pressure the United States further, while others warned that a declaration of war could draw the full weight of American industry and military power into the European theater. Ultimately, Hitler's ideological convictions and strategic miscalculations drove him toward a decision that would reshape the course of the war. Hitler's reaction to Pearl Harbor was shaped as much by emotion and ideology as by strategic analysis. He despised the United States, viewing it as a melting pot of races incompatible with his vision of Aryan supremacy. He believed that the American political system was controlled by Jews and therefore inherently hostile to the Reich. The attack on Pearl Harbor seemed, in his mind, to confirm the fragility and decadence of American society. Hitler imagined that the United States would crumble under the pressure of a two-front war, one in the Pacific and another in the Atlantic, allowing Germany to complete its campaigns in Europe and Russia without interference. These assumptions were rooted in a profound misunderstanding of American resilience, economic strength, and industrial capacity. Nevertheless, they played a central role in convincing Hitler that the moment had come to confront the United States. In Washington, the shock of Pearl Harbor unified political factions that had long been divided over the question of entering the war. Isolationists, interventionists, Republicans, and Democrats alike rallied behind Roosevelt's declaration that the Japanese attack marked a day of infamy. American public opinion, once wary of overseas entanglements, shifted almost instantly toward a determination to respond with overwhelming force. The attack provided Roosevelt with the political mandate he had lacked for years. While the United States declared war on Japan within hours, the broader question of whether the nation would engage Germany and Italy remained open. Roosevelt understood that Hitler posed a more significant long-term threat than Japan, but he could not declare war on Germany without provocation. As a result, the administration awaited Hitler's next move, uncertain whether the German dictator would take the fateful step of expanding the conflict. Inside the German High Command, reactions to Pearl Harbor were mixed. Military leaders were increasingly aware of the challenges posed by the Eastern Front, where the Wehrmacht was becoming bogged down in the harsh winter and facing fierce Soviet resistance. For many officers, the prospect of adding the United States to Germany's list of enemies was alarming. They recognized that American industrial capacity, once fully mobilized, could dwarf that of Germany and provide the Allies with a decisive advantage. Yet few dared openly challenge Hitler's authority or question his strategic decisions. The Führer was convinced that Japan's entry into the war would force the United States into a prolonged Pacific struggle, reducing the likelihood of significant American intervention in Europe. This belief, though unfounded, shaped the German military's acceptance of Hitler's growing willingness to escalate the conflict. The Japanese government, for its part, expected Germany to immediately declare war on the United States. Japanese diplomats approached Berlin with confidence, believing that the Tripartite Pact had created a mutual obligation to stand together against American power. Tokyo viewed the attack on Pearl Harbor as the opening gambit in a broader strategy to establish Japanese dominance in Asia and the Pacific. Japanese leaders hoped that Germany's support would deter the United States from launching a full-scale mobilization. However, they underestimated both Hitler's independent strategic calculus and the complexities of German-American relations. While Berlin expressed enthusiasm and solidarity, Hitler had not yet made a final decision. He wanted to assess the situation more fully before taking a step that would permanently alter the trajectory of the war. Within Europe itself, reactions to Pearl Harbor varied widely. Britain celebrated the American entry into the war, recognizing that U.S. support could finally tip the balance in the Allies' favor. Churchill, who had long sought to bring the United States into the conflict, understood immediately that Japan's attack would trigger a transformation in American policy. The British Prime Minister also recognized that the United States would inevitably confront Germany, whether or not Hitler declared war first. Churchill's assessment was grounded in the belief that the United States, once mobilized, would be unstoppable. He delivered speeches emphasizing the unity and determination of the Allied nations, welcoming the United States into what he framed as a global struggle for freedom. Churchill's confidence contrasted starkly with the jubilant yet uncertain mood in Berlin. Within Germany itself, public reaction to the attack on Pearl Harbor was shaped largely by propaganda. Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda portrayed the strike as a devastating blow to American prestige and military capability. Newspapers, radio broadcasts, and newsreels emphasized the destruction of American battleships and the apparent vulnerability of the Pacific Fleet. Hitler's decision to declare war on the United States did not occur in a vacuum. It was rooted in a dense web of miscalculations, ideological distortions, and strategic illusions that increasingly dominated his worldview by late 1941. The Führer's judgment, once grounded in a shrewd if ruthless reading of geopolitical realities, had become clouded by overconfidence, fueled by years of unchecked victories. The collapse of France, the overrunning of much of Europe, and the initial successes of Operation Barbarossa reinforced Hitler's belief that he possessed a unique, almost mystical intuition for strategy. This belief hardened into a dangerous conviction that Germany was destined to triumph regardless of the material odds stacked against it. In this environment, rational assessments of American industrial might, military potential, or global influence had little room to influence Hitler's thinking. Instead, he increasingly relied on emotional impulses, ideological certainties, and a profound underestimation of the United States. Central to Hitler's miscalculation was his deeply flawed perception of American society. Nazi ideology framed the United States as a racially mixed nation, incapable of the unity, discipline, or ideological cohesion required for sustained conflict. Hitler viewed the American population as a collection of disparate ethnic groups, immigrants, minorities, and what he considered inferior races, held together by a political system he believed was weak and corrupted by capitalist and Jewish influence. In his view, such a society could not muster the collective will to engage in a global war against a racially unified and militarily disciplined Germany. This racist worldview blinded Hitler to the enormous industrial, technological, and demographic resources at America's disposal. He failed to perceive that the very diversity he despised was a source of strength, innovation, and resilience. Strategically, Hitler remained convinced that the United States was fundamentally a naval and air power with limited ability to project force into Europe. He believed that America's geographic distance and lack of a large standing army would prevent it from threatening Germany in the short term. This belief was reinforced by his assumption that the United States would be primarily consumed by fighting Japan in the Pacific. Hitler imagined a long, grinding struggle between the United States and Japan that would tie up American forces, resources, and political attention for years. In this scenario, Germany would have ample time to finish off the Soviet Union, consolidate its control over Europe and North Africa, and fortify itself into an impregnable fortress that no distant power could hope to challenge. Crucial to Hitler's misjudgment was his profound misreading of American industrial potential. Long before the United States entered the war, Roosevelt had begun mobilizing American industry on a scale unmatched in world history. Aircraft factories, shipyards, automobile plants, and steel mills were already transitioning towards wartime production. Roosevelt's call to become the arsenal of democracy had unleashed a transformation that would soon dwarf the industrial output of all Axis powers combined. Yet, Hitler dismissed American production statistics as propaganda or evidence of economic waste. He could not fathom that a capitalist, democratic society, without the coercive machinery of a totalitarian state, could mobilize itself with such speed and efficiency. This blindness to industrial reality became one of the defining strategic errors of his leadership. Hitler also drastically underestimated American scientific and technological capacity. Even before entering the war, the United States had begun investing heavily in aviation, radar, code breaking, and other innovations that would soon revolutionize warfare. Hitler, whose regime often stifled scientific progress through ideological constraints and political favoritism, failed to appreciate the magnitude of America's research capabilities. He remained convinced that Germany's existing technological edge, exemplified by its advanced U-boats, tanks, and aircraft, would remain unchallenged. He did not anticipate that the United States would rapidly develop new classes of warships, long-range bombers, and advanced electronics that would fundamentally alter the strategic landscape. By the time Germany recognized the extent of America's technological surge, it was too late to adapt effectively. Another core element of Hitler's miscalculation stemmed from his belief in the inevitability of Germany's victory over the Soviet Union. Despite the mounting challenges on the Eastern Front, Hitler remained convinced that the USSR would collapse within months. He believed that capturing key cities such as Moscow, Leningrad, and Stalingrad would force the Soviet government to surrender. In this worldview, any conflict with the United States would unfold after the Soviet Union had already been eliminated as a threat. The failure to achieve a decisive victory in the East by late 1941 did little to shake Hitler's faith in this outcome. Instead, he interpreted setbacks as temporary obstacles. He believed that once the Soviet Union fell, Germany could redeploy massive forces to fortify the Atlantic coast and focus on a prolonged naval and aerial struggle against the United States, a battle he was convinced America would be unwilling to sustain. This faith in inevitability was fueled by Hitler's belief that destiny favored Germany, a belief that grew stronger as his dictatorship solidified. Years of rule without internal challenge created an environment in which dissenting opinions were suppressed, strategic warnings were ignored, and military advice was filtered through the lens of ideological loyalty. Hitler surrounded himself with officials who praised his brilliance and reinforced his preconceptions. In such an echo chamber, the dangers posed by American mobilization were minimized or dismissed outright. Hitler increasingly viewed himself as a historical figure, chosen to reshape the world, and therefore believed that even improbable risks would resolve in his favor. This delusional confidence contributed to decisions that contradicted both traditional strategic logic and the cautious counsel of some of his own generals. Hitler's contempt for the United States was reinforced by his belief that America lacked martial tradition and fighting spirit. He viewed Americans as consumers rather than soldiers, people accustomed to comfort, prosperity, and material abundance. In his eyes, such a society would not be able to endure the sacrifices required for total war. He contrasted this with what he saw as Germany's superior discipline, ideological commitment, and national unity. This belief ignored the reality that the United States had proven itself in World War I and possessed a vast pool of manpower capable of being mobilized. Moreover, Hitler failed to recognize the central role patriotism, democratic values, and wartime leadership would play in galvanizing American resolve. The attack on Pearl Harbor created exactly the kind of unifying event Hitler believed Americans were incapable of experiencing. A major contributor to Hitler's miscalculation was his assumption that the United States would be unable to coordinate effectively with Britain and the Soviet Union. He believed that the Allies' differing political systems, strategic priorities, and ideologies would prevent long-term cooperation. Hitler imagined that Britain, still reeling from years of war, would be reluctant to serve as America's junior partner, while the United States would refuse to support a communist nation such as the USSR. This expectation of Allied fragmentation proved disastrously incorrect. Instead of dividing, the Allies forged an unprecedented coalition based on shared objectives: the defeat of the Axis powers and the preservation of global stability. The United States brought economic power, Britain offered strategic experience, and the Soviet Union supplied vast manpower. Together, they became a force far more formidable than Hitler had ever imagined. Hitler also failed to appreciate the psychological impact of Pearl Harbor on American society. He believed that the attack would demoralize the United States, weaken its confidence, and undermine its political unity. Instead, it had the opposite effect. The shock galvanized the American public, transcending political divisions and generating a resolve unmatched in the nation's history. Hitler misinterpreted American outrage as temporary emotionalism, rather than a transformative moment that would define the nation's wartime purpose. In this misreading, he underestimated the American capacity for long-term mobilization, sacrifice, and strategic commitment. The attack on Pearl Harbor became a rallying cry that fueled American determination to pursue victory across both the Atlantic and Pacific theaters. On the morning of December 11, 1941, the German Reichstag convened for what would become one of the most consequential sessions in the history of the Nazi regime. Just 4 days had passed since Japan's surprise attack on Pearl Harbor, and the world was still reeling from the shock. Yet Adolf Hitler entered the Kroll Opera House, where the Reichstag regularly met, not as a cautious statesman weighing the gravity of global war, but as a man consumed by ideological certainty and emboldened by years of military success. The atmosphere inside the chamber was electric, with party officials, military leaders, and bureaucrats crowding the aisles. Many had no idea what Hitler would announce, though rumors had already spread that the Führer intended to address Germany's position regarding the United States. Those who anticipated a dramatic proclamation were not disappointed. Hitler stepped to the podium with the self-assured posture of a man convinced that history had already vindicated him. His speech, which lasted nearly an hour, was delivered with a mixture of theatrical intensity and calculated rhetoric. He began by framing Germany as a victim of American hostility, attempting to portray the United States as the aggressor whose actions had made war unavoidable. This narrative was constructed from a mixture of distortions, exaggerations, and outright falsehoods. Hitler claimed that Roosevelt had long sought to undermine Germany, that the United States had secretly instigated the war in Europe, and that American political elites were driven by Jewish conspiracy. These accusations were consistent with Hitler's worldview, but they bore little resemblance to reality. Nonetheless, they served his purpose: to justify a decision that he had already made long before the Reichstag gathered. Throughout the speech, Hitler portrayed Franklin D. Roosevelt as the architect of global chaos. He accused the American president of provoking conflicts, violating neutrality, and systematically expanding U.S. involvement in Europe. The speech was filled with bitter invective, delivered with the dramatic flair that Hitler had mastered over years of political oratory. He painted the relationship between Germany and the United States as one poisoned by American duplicity and aggression. Roosevelt, Hitler argued, had secretly encouraged Britain to resist, supported the Soviet Union, and used economic pressure against the Reich. These claims were designed to rally the German public and justify what Hitler framed as a defensive response. By recasting the United States as the instigator of conflict, Hitler sought to legitimize his next move before the nation and the world. A crucial moment in the speech came when Hitler discussed the Tripartite Pact. Although the treaty did not obligate Germany to declare war when Japan initiated hostilities, Hitler argued that the spirit of the alliance demanded solidarity. He portrayed Japan's attack on Pearl Harbor as a heroic blow against Western imperialism, framing it as a moment of liberation for Asia and a decisive challenge to American power. Hitler claimed that Japan had been forced into war by U.S. encirclement, echoing the discourse Tokyo itself had used. In presenting the conflict as a unified struggle against Anglo-American dominance, Hitler attempted to portray the Axis as a coalition resisting oppression. This rhetorical strategy aimed to transform the war into a global ideological confrontation, thereby making Germany's declaration seem not only logical but morally justified from the Nazi point of view. Behind the theatrics of Hitler's speech lurked a far more complex reality. The decision to declare war on the United States had not been made under pressure from Japan, nor had it been driven by strategic necessity. Instead, it reflected Hitler's long-standing ideological hatred of the United States, his miscalculations about American strength, and his belief that fate had placed Germany in a position of global leadership. Hitler believed that Germany was already locked in an undeclared war with the United States, citing naval clashes in the Atlantic and American support for Britain and the Soviet Union. In his mind, formalizing the war would simply recognize what was already a reality. This logic, grounded in paranoia and ideological rigidity, ignored the broader strategic implications of confronting a nation with enormous industrial capacity and untapped military potential. As Hitler continued, the tone of the speech shifted from accusation to triumphalism. He boasted of Germany's military achievements, emphasizing the rapid conquest of much of Europe and the ongoing campaign in the Soviet Union. Hitler portrayed the German army as invincible, dismissing the mounting challenges and logistical problems on the Eastern Front. These boasts were designed to instill confidence, but they masked the growing strain within the Wehrmacht. Even as Hitler delivered his speech, German forces were facing one of the harshest winters in Russian history, struggling with supply shortages and fierce Soviet resistance. Yet none of these realities intruded upon the carefully orchestrated narrative presented to the Reichstag. Hitler insisted that Germany was on the brink of final victory, a claim that only reinforced his belief that confronting the United States would not significantly alter the outcome of the war. Toward the climax of his speech, Hitler turned once again to ideology, invoking racial, cultural, and historical themes central to Nazi propaganda. He depicted the conflict as a struggle between civilizations, the Aryan world, led by Germany, and the decaying democratic capitalist world, led by the United States. He insisted that America was controlled by Jewish financiers and international conspirators, seeking to undermine Germany's rightful place in the world. These themes were not new. They had been part of Hitler's rhetoric for decades, but their reappearance in this pivotal speech underscored how deeply ideology had replaced strategic rationality in shaping Hitler's decisions. He believed that Germany's war was not merely a geopolitical contest, but a battle for the future of civilization, a framing that left no room for compromise or negotiation. Finally, after nearly an hour of escalating rhetoric, Hitler delivered the decisive declaration. With a dramatic flourish, he announced that Germany was now at war with the United States. The Reichstag chamber erupted in applause as Nazi officials rose to their feet in a display of orchestrated enthusiasm. In reality, the declaration was a unilateral decision. The Reichstag served merely as a stage on which Hitler performed his predetermined policy. Yet the symbolic significance of the moment was immense. With those words, Hitler had widened the war to encompass the world's largest industrial power, ensuring that the conflict would become not a regional or continental struggle, but a truly global one. The decision sealed Germany's fate by aligning its future against a nation capable of producing more tanks, ships, planes, and weapons than the Axis could ever hope to match. Outside the chamber, reactions varied widely among German officials and military leaders. Some welcomed the decision, convinced by Hitler's arguments or driven by ideological alignment with the war against democracy. Others were stunned, recognizing the implications of war with the United States, but afraid to voice dissent. Senior officers in the Wehrmacht quietly lamented the decision, aware that Germany was already stretched thin on multiple fronts. Diplomats and intelligence officers understood that American entry into the war would tip the global balance of power against the Axis. Yet within the political machinery of the Nazi regime, opposition to Hitler's decision was impossible. The Führer's authority was absolute, and the declaration of war stood as a testament to his unchecked power and to the grave consequences of a system built around a single individual's ideology and ego. In Washington, Hitler's declaration of war produced a sense of grim clarity. Roosevelt had expected Germany to make a move, but could not predict when or how Hitler would respond. The declaration relieved the administration of the political and legal constraints that had previously limited America's involvement in the European theater. Congress responded quickly and overwhelmingly, issuing its own formal declaration of war against Germany. The American public, still united and outraged by Pearl Harbor, accepted the expanded conflict with determination. Roosevelt used the moment to frame the war as a global struggle against tyranny and aggression, drawing parallels between Nazi Germany, Fascist Italy, and Imperial Japan. Hitler's decision removed any ambiguity about the direction of the war, aligning American military and industrial power firmly against the Axis. Hitler's declaration of war on the United States on December 11, 1941, unleashed a chain reaction that would alter the trajectory of World War II and ultimately seal the fate of the Third Reich. What Hitler envisioned as a bold and decisive move was, in reality, a catastrophic miscalculation that expanded the conflict beyond Germany's capacity to sustain it. Until that moment, the war had largely been confined to Europe, North Africa, and parts of Asia. By drawing the United States into the European theater as a formal belligerent, Hitler transformed a continental conflict into a truly global war, one that Germany was entirely unprepared to fight. His decision ignored both military realities and economic constraints, revealing the extent to which ideology had overtaken strategy within the Nazi leadership. The most immediate consequence of Germany's declaration was the unification of American public opinion. Before Pearl Harbor, the United States had been deeply divided, with isolationists arguing against involvement in European conflicts. Hitler's declaration erased any lingering debate. The American people, already shocked by Japan's attack, now viewed the Axis as a unified threat that had to be confronted with total commitment. This unity allowed President Roosevelt to mobilize the nation on an unprecedented scale, expanding the war effort with both public approval and political momentum. Hitler had inadvertently given Roosevelt what he had struggled to achieve for 2 years, a mandate to wage full-scale war against Germany. Economically, the entry of the United States into the war unleashed the full force of American industrial capacity. The United States possessed resources unmatched by any other nation: vast oil reserves, sprawling factory networks, an enormous labor force, and the ability to convert civilian industries into military production at astonishing speed. American factories produced tanks, aircraft, ships, and weapons in quantities the Axis could not hope to match. Germany, already strained by the invasion of the Soviet Union and shortages in raw materials, found itself facing an opponent with almost limitless production potential. The war had become a battle of industrial might, and Hitler had placed Germany on the losing side of that contest. The strategic implications were equally severe. With the United States now committed to the European theater, Germany faced a two-front war on a scale unlike anything in its history. The Wehrmacht was already overextended in the Soviet Union, where brutal winter conditions and fierce resistance were wearing down German forces. The addition of American military power meant that Germany would soon face overwhelming opposition in the air, at sea, and on land. The Allies could now launch coordinated operations across multiple theaters, forcing Germany to divide its limited resources. Every new front opened, North Africa, Italy, France, further weakened Germany's ability to sustain its offensives or stabilize its defenses. At sea, the consequences were immediate and devastating. The German U-boat fleet, initially successful in attacking British shipping, now confronted the full might of the U.S. Navy. American destroyers, aircraft carriers, Long-range patrol planes and improved radar technology drastically reduced the effectiveness of Germany's submarine campaign. The Battle of the Atlantic, once a contest Germany might have won, shifted decisively in favor of the Allies. Supplies, reinforcements, and raw materials now flowed from America to Britain and the Soviet Union with increasing efficiency, strengthening the Allied war effort and ensuring that Germany's enemies remained well-equipped for the duration of the conflict. On the home front, the German population began to feel the consequences of Hitler's decision as Allied bombing raids intensified. American heavy bombers, working in conjunction with the British Royal Air Force, launched massive air campaigns against German industrial centers, transportation networks, and civilian populations. Factories that produced tanks, aircraft, and ammunition were repeatedly targeted, crippling Germany's ability to maintain its war machine. Cities burned, thousands died, and morale deteriorated as the civilian population experienced the brutal reality of total war. Hitler had brought the industrial might of the United States directly into German airspace, with devastating effects. Diplomatically, the declaration pushed previously neutral or hesitant nations closer to the Allied camp. Countries that had been wary of Germany's expansion now saw the United States as a stabilizing force, capable of countering Hitler's aggression. The entry of America into the war strengthened the global coalition against the Axis, enhancing cooperation among the Allies in intelligence, logistics, and strategic planning. Conferences such as those in Casablanca, Tehran, and later Yalta became possible because the United States emerged as a central pillar in the Allied alliance. Hitler's belief that the United States was disunited, decadent, or unwilling to fight collapsed in the face of overwhelming American resolve and coordination. Militarily, the impact of Hitler's decision became clear in the years that followed. American forces poured into the European and Mediterranean theaters, participating in operations that would gradually dismantle the Axis powers. The invasion of North Africa in 1942, the campaign in Italy, the strategic bombing offensive, and ultimately the D-Day landings in 1944, all were made possible by the entry of the United States into the war. Without Hitler's declaration, the timeline of these operations might have been delayed or altered dramatically. By choosing to engage the United States directly, Hitler accelerated the process that would lead to the collapse of his empire. Within the Nazi leadership, the consequences of the decision gradually became apparent, though none dared challenge Hitler openly. High-ranking officials such as Albert Speer and Karl Donitz later acknowledged that declaring war on the United States was one of the gravest strategic errors of the regime. Yet at the time, Hitler's aura of invincibility and the oppressive atmosphere of the dictatorship silenced dissent. The decision revealed the systemic failures of the Nazi government, the lack of institutional checks on the Führer, the subordination of military strategy to ideological fantasy, and the inability of senior leaders to confront a dangerous and misguided policy. Germany's fate had become tied to the impulses of a single individual. As the war progressed, the United States emerged as the backbone of the Allied effort, supplying weapons, ammunition, vehicles, food, fuel, and manpower on a scale that transformed the global balance of power. The American Lend-Lease program expanded exponentially, sending critical supplies to both Britain and the Soviet Union. American logistical capabilities ensured that the Allies could sustain long campaigns across continents and oceans. In contrast, Germany struggled with shortages, logistical failures, and an economy that had never been fully mobilized for total war until it was too late. Hitler had effectively ensured that Germany would be fighting against an enemy with superior resources, better coordination, and a unified vision for victory. By 1944, the consequences of Hitler's decision were undeniable. The Allies had established a foothold in Western Europe, the Soviets were advancing relentlessly from the east, and Germany found itself trapped between two massive fronts. American soldiers fought alongside British, Canadian, Polish, French, and other Allied forces in the liberation of Europe, demonstrating the multinational strength of the coalition Hitler unwittingly unified. The weight of American air power, armor, and production overwhelmed Germany's diminishing ability to resist. Every day that the war continued, the disparity between the Axis and the Allies grew wider, pushing Germany closer to inevitable defeat. Ultimately, Hitler's decision to declare war on the United States stands as one of the most disastrous strategic blunders in modern history. It was a decision driven not by rational calculation, but by ideology, arrogance, and profound underestimation of America's potential. Hitler believed that the United States was a divided and weakened nation, incapable of sustaining a prolonged conflict. He saw American democracy as fragile and American society as internally conflicted. But these assumptions proved fatally flawed. The United States responded with unity, determination, and industrial power on a scale that transformed the world. Hitler's misjudgment hastened the downfall of the Third Reich and ensured that Germany would face an adversary it could never defeat.